Welcome back. In this video, I'll be covering Learning Objective 13.5, summarize the conditions that can reduce prejudice for PSY 235, Social Psychology. So we spent the whole chapter kind of understanding the nature of prejudice, where it comes from, what things can exacerbate it, what kind of effects can it have on people. So how can we reduce it? When people are given examples of challenging information that challenges their stereotypes, unfortunately, just educating people isn't enough, because most of the time they're not going to change their general belief. So, for example, let's say that you have a stereotype about a particular group of people, and you believe that they are simply not very smart. And then you are given an example, maybe two or three, of excellent scholars from that group. You may come back and say, yeah, well, they're just exceptions to the rule, and the rule remains intact. So what tends to happen, rather than, throwing out your entire box, your stereotype box for that group, you're just going to create a little box off to the side that says, here are the unusual specimens from this group. They are the hyperachievers, but they are not representative of their group. That leaves you able to preserve your prejudicial attitude. Part of why that we do this is because prejudice is in many ways emotional. It's based on fear, it's based on anger, it's based on hostility, it could be based on pity and disgust. All of those negative emotional things are hard to confront with facts, because it doesn't erase the feeling. And the feeling is something that, if it's connected to fear and anger, we don't want to embrace the idea that these people in this other group may not be what we thought they were. Anger and fear are hard to let go of. So if you magnify that by some of what your authors call cognitive ruts, is basically highly accessible pathways to stereotypes, we tend to have a really hard time letting those go. And we will tend to just put exceptions off to the side, and sometimes really just amplify the misinformation that justifies our stereotypes, sort of combating any dissonance we might feel. Remember our old friend cognitive dissonance? When you're presented with a challenge of an example that violates your pre-existing stereotypes, that causes dissonance. How are you going to reduce it? One way is to segment off that exception and put them in a box. Another way is to deny that the exception exists at all, right? So that leaves your stereotype intact, and sometimes it even makes the stereotype deeper. So in some cases, attempting to educate people as to why their stereotypes are wrong can make their stereotypes stronger. So, your first instinct might be to teach people stuff. So when we present people with disconfirming evidence, it can actually strengthen their stereotypical beliefs, because the evidence causes dissonance, and we reduce that dissonance by producing additional reasons for why we're right. And then we hold on to those beliefs. So simply telling people that they're wrong isn't going to work to reduce prejudice. What does work is a combination of things. One of the original ideas was the contact hypothesis. And the idea was simply, if you put people together who are different from different social groups, that should be able to reduce prejudice. And this, became known as the contact hypothesis. During the period where Brown versus Board of Education, which was a landmark Supreme Court ruling that required the states to desegregate the schools, and that's a gross oversimplification of the ruling, but bear with me. The idea was, if we simply put black and white people together in the same schools, they would learn about each other and their levels of prejudice and discrimination would go down. Unfortunately, that's not sufficient. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient for reducing actual prejudice. So contact with groups, when it is meaningful, can in fact improve people's attitudes. So if we, for instance, if people have attitudes that are fairly negative toward, say, older people, if individuals who have those attitudes are brought into frequent contact with older people, their attitudes tend to improve. Same with a variety of other groups. At the same time, though, it really matters how the contact is constructed. If you just leave people to their own devices and you put them in the same building, they're just going to segregate within the same building. If, however, you give them meaningful ways to interact with one another, that's when the contact hypothesis actually works. So let's look at some of these problems with the contact hypothesis before we go any farther. One problem is you have to, for the contact hypothesis to be effective, you have to have people have meaningful intergroup contacts with each other. You can't just simply herd them into the same physical space and expect good things to happen. In fact, problems might ensue if you don't. Another problem is that the social interactions between the groups, in other words, intergroup interactions, if they are not organized, so if you don't give people things that are constructive to do and they're just put together, their interactions may actually amplify their level of mistrust and anxiety, which itself can amplify prejudices and create circumstances for discrimination. The biggest problem, though, is that sometimes intergroup relations can actually become hostile, and that usually increases prejudice. So in Cleveland right now, there's some plans in play. Like there's been a proposal put out that they're going to consolidate some school districts and combine some high schools. And there's a lot of concern in the community that since two of these high schools are competitors, that they don't like each other very much, and there's a lot of prejudice between them, that combining them is going to be combustible, that it will blow up. Now, the social science says if you're not careful about how you create that new school, yes, that can happen. You can create a combustible environment if you just throw people together without any sort of constructive context for that merging. So what we need to do is think about what are some ways that we can nurture positive contacts when we are trying to build connections between groups that have a history of negative contact. Indirect forms of contact can have positive effects, but they can also have negative effects. It really depends on the context. One effect that's been documented in research is something called the extended contact effect, and it shows that knowing just even one or two in-group members have an out-group friend. So you don't have direct contact with that out-group friend, but you know that friends of yours from your in-group have out-group friends. That can actually reduce prejudice. So let's say that your in-group has fairly negative attitudes toward LGBT people, but you know a good friend of yours who's a member of your in-group who has a couple of gay friends. And you're thinking, I still have this good friend and they're my good friend, but here's some dissonance for me. I have a problem. My good friend has friends that I'm not supposed to like. What do I do with that? What tends to happen is you're going to drift in the direction of your friend's attitudes toward that outgroup, and it can actually soften some of your feelings toward them. There's also the possibility of media contact. So here, when we see, and this is part of what happened with the gay marriage transformation over the course of the 1990s and early 2000s is that what we saw was a lot more media attention paid to out LGBT people, people who were comfortable with themselves and they were out in the media, that their relationships were being shown on screen. There were whole stories being told about them and so on. So as those media examples started to be shown, you got a lot of audience members who were starting to show emotional connections to those media figures. This is called having parasocial contact with them. It's indirect. You aren't having any direct personal interaction with these individuals, but because they're there and they're influential and you like them, you start to shift your attitudes toward them. So, for example, when we had through the 90s and into the early 2000s, more and more celebrities who were LGBT themselves were talking about their relationships. They were coming out. They were shown on the red carpet holding hands with their partners. They were talking about their lives. People who liked them as actors, as singers, as whatever, people who liked them experienced some dissonance because they had these negative attitudes towards those groups, but they really like this celebrity. This celebrity is really cool. What that can do is, for a significant percentage of the population who is in this parasocial kind of connection to the celebrity, they can drift in the direction of saying, I now support people like them. There's also the possibility through the media of witnessing intergroup contacts that are positive. Sometimes it's through news stories, through the entertainment media. This is referred to as vicarious contact. One example of this, and maybe it's a little bit of the first one as well, the parasocial side, but the success of shows like RuPaul's Drag Race is really instructive here. The fact that so many people from across the culture have consumed that media of drag queens, and just watching their transformations, looking at the drama of their stories and whatever, they're getting vicarious contact of those groups by watching them interact. And it can, in fact, reduce prejudice toward those groups. Now, it doesn't mean there isn't going to be backlash. We're certainly seeing that now, but over time, those sorts of media contacts where they're not direct can have a softening effect on attitudes. Anxiety is a common experience that we have when we are coming into contact with our outgroups. When we are brought into intergroup interactions, when we're having when we're in a context where we have to have interactions with someone that we don't know and they're a member of an outgroup, they're different from us in some way, the most common emotion is anxiety. That can then transform itself into outright fear. It can transform itself into anger, into other kinds of toxic emotions as well. So anxiety during these interactions are a core reason that people just don't interact with people at all who are in other groups, who are in our outgroups. Neuroscientists have shown that people, when they think about interacting with people who have stigmatized identities, they show patterns of physiological arousal that are associated with fear and threat. And that means at a biological level, it's not just intellectual fear, it's actual biological anxiety. When we have these kinds of fear experiences, these anxiety experiences, you're more likely to be someone who is unfamiliar with other groups and uncomfortable with other groups, and your lack of experience actually amplifies your sense of threat and anxiety. When we expect intergroup interactions to be negative, we tend to be more anxious and more fearful. That can actually change our perceptions of the way intergroup interactions go. If we expect an interaction to go badly, like the self-fulfilling prophecy says, it shapes the way we act and that can tend to bring out threatening behaviors on the part of other people. So, if we expect the interaction to be worse, they actually are worse. If, however, we expect interactions to be positive, they tend to be more positive. Real interactions tend to be pretty benign. It's our emotions that we let get in the way. When we have more contact with people, it tends to reduce these kinds of fears and anxiety reactions that we can have when we're brought into contact with our outgroups. Now that concludes the first part of my coverage of Learning Objective 13.5. We'll continue our discussion of this learning objective in the next video.